The Skinwalker. Well, I guess this story starts with 5 of us guys. We were anywhere from 8 to 11 years old when we first met, but in my mind we were always kind of timeless and definitely unbreakable when we were together, which made us reckless, looking back. The things you'll do when you believe you're invincible, it's crazy. We were stupid as shit sometimes, catching a ride on moving trains, flipping the fishing boat trying to ride it down the spillway, almost blowing up an old mill with Chet's grandpa's dynamite. We weren't the only ones doing that kind of stuff. In our area, Silas blamed it on the forest. He said it made people do crazy things, living out in the wilderness, or at least on the brink of it. The town we grew up in was surrounded by national parks. We kind of had an obligation to explore their heritage. I called Silas a lot of things, but I couldn't tell him he was wrong about what he'd said. It was like the tree lines called to us day and night, whispering us away from every spare moment we could share with it. In the summertime, we'd sneak out, each of us claiming to be at one another's house. Instead, we'd make our way to the woods for a weekend camping trip, and that was my childhood. None of our parents even thought to question us. In fact, I think they were just excited that they had the night, or better yet, the weekend off. All our parents worked pretty hard to keep the households going and store up their own little nest eggs. So, when they actually got a chance to enjoy themselves, it was kind of like our gift back to them. Well, almost all of them. Jax's dad wasn't the best egg. He was worse than Silas's sperm donor had been. When no one else was around, he'd turn into a grade-A shitbag. We didn't know everything, but we did know he hit Jax's mom, because we saw it once when we were spending the night and he didn't know it. From then on, we all suspected he did the same thing to Jax, but he never admitted it. He was the real kind of tough guy, the quiet kind. We all let him maintain that image, and he'd usually get real quiet when things got bad at home. So when it would get to the point where he'd be pissy and quiet all the time, we'd try to snap him back to reality as best we could. And we'd go face our shit like men, out in the wild, camping with a stolen 12-pack and whatever bottle of something cheap and gross we could get our hands on. We lived by our own rules out there. We'd laugh about how foolish other people were, the stupid things they gave a shit about. And while we were at it, we were sure to buff Jax around in tougher ways. We called it Operation Kill Switch Engaged. That was kind of our stupid code word back then for knowing he needed to blow off some steam or he might explode with his quiet rage. He loved to wrestle and play rough, so we'd jump right in and turn it into a game. Us against him. We'd each take turns until he was exhausted, and usually by the time he was ready to finally tap out, he'd be breathing heavy but laughing more lightly. It was like you could see the weight lifting off his shoulders. We liked to pretend to each other that we were easy on him, and overacted our defeats like we'd seen on WWE, but I was always huffing and puffing and generally throbbing before pretending I'd had enough. He could really deal a beating. There was something about just us guys out under the night sky in our tarp tents and blankets back then. It was carefree. We had nothing to be afraid of while we howled defiantly at the canopy above. We had no idea what was out there back then. And now that I'm aware, it was probably for the better. Those turned into some of my favorite memories. When Jax's dad passed away, we spent an entire week under those canopies. Bobby had brought one of his dad's nature books with a list of all the edible plants littered through the local forests. We'd stuck close together while Chet had accidentally tripped on the wrong kind of mushrooms. And then, because it had been such a funny experience, we'd all tried them again. That time Silas had eaten the wrong one, And while we'd all run through the forest, howling at the moon and dancing around our fires, as if to dare the night to send us its worst, 'cause we could take it, Silas had been in the tree line shitting his pants between heaving his guts out. We'd all woken up the next morning to find him, bare butt, laying on the rocks with his pants tied to his wrist by a makeshift string. The current of the river the pants were drifting in had yanked hard enough at the knot on his wrist that it had turned it into a torture device. His hand was blue. I'd thought it would be funny to cut the line, save his hand, and hide the pants all at once, scare the shit out of him again. When he woke up, we all had gone back to pretending to be asleep after stashing the soppy pants into a wet bag we'd hidden inside of mine, planning all the while to give 'em back later. But when he'd realized the string had broken, he freaked out. He ran half naked along the riverside trying to find the clothes he'd lost in the sweeping currents. I'd never heard Silas swear so much, but he explained the situation to us, and we tried to be as serious as possible while holding back laughter at our little joke. After shitting his pants, he'd been exhausted, he'd said. Wrenching from both ends takes a lot out of ya. So he used the last of his strength to clean up the pants because they were the only ones he'd brought. He hadn't thought to ask any one of us if we had an extra pair that would most likely fit him, and we did, by the way. But we let him think he'd lost his pants forever and he was going to have to walk back home with no clothes but his shirt, which wouldn't have covered his Peter. We let him walk all the way back to the edge of the forest, thinking he'd have to somehow make it at least halfway across town, to the first of our houses, almost naked. And then, just when he was about to take that first brave step out into the open, Chet had piped up and asked him if he wanted to use a pair of his basketball shorts, or if he was set on doing this whole thing without pants. I'd never seen Silas turn so red. That was the best. That kind of sums up our childhood together. Now, fast forward 20 years. Each of us has started our adult lives, and we made a promise to try to meet and go camping at least once every year. And for the last 6, most of us have made it. Once, just to make that quota, we'd gotten together in the middle of December. It had actually been an adventure. We made snow forts with fallen branches as roofs. It was actually the coolest trip we've had so far. No pun intended. But as the years had passed, it had gotten harder to plan with our busy schedules, and when we did have time off, none of us really felt like roughing it. Besides Silas, all us guys had kind of found our things and gotten into a rhythm. He was always a little different than the rest of the group. He took nature pretty seriously. Not in the annoying, preachy way, but when we'd go out, he'd walk around the forest without shoes on. Sometimes we'd find him just sitting in the trees murmuring like he was talking to them, but as soon as he saw us, he'd go back to his normal self and laugh at us for making a big deal out of anything. The last 2 years, 1 or 2 of us has been missing. My grandpa passed away, so I missed one the same year Chet's stock in Bitcoin took a shit, and he was stuck doing damage control for his clients. He was on the ground floor of the currency and normally kept his activities pretty close to his chest. Jax and Bobby had missed the year before that for their own various reasons. I can't remember what they were anymore, and this year, Silas had completely ghosted us. We decided that instead of going out and hoofing it in the forests, we'd hit the Vegas Strip instead. Treat ourselves to a luxurious weekend, with beers and distractions aplenty. He didn't tell us why he'd decided not to show up, but we all kinda got it. He was probably disappointed that we were already backing down from our routine camping trips. He'd probably have said something like, "It's a steady slope, fellas." He always had been the broody type, though on the surface he stayed pretty optimistic. Anyway, we all figured he had his reasons since he was the one who normally set these trips up and held us to them. Once we'd gotten home from this last trip, we all kind of waited to hear from him. It was nice at first. We all had a reason to reach out to each other. Instead of the barrage of texts before one of our trips, it was, "Hey, anyone heard from Freebird?" into a group chat or something like that. But after about 6 months of radio silence, we started to get worried. Suddenly, it wasn't funny chit-chat. It was, okay, who was the last person who heard from Silas, and who's going to file the missing persons complaint? Chet called his mom and stepdad. They said they'd last talked to him 6 months before, but they were used to him disappearing for long periods of time. It wasn't odd for them until they heard that he'd planned on being there for our Vegas trip. After enough factors hadn't added up, his mother had rummaged through his things and found his banking information. She'd watched a lot of true crime, and I think she had a nose for this kind of stuff. It showed he hadn't touched a dime in 3 months, our first lead. After further digging, they'd told us he'd set up a trip. He'd planned on taking a retreat to the mountains to learn from some famous internet medicine man. He was known for exchanging personal labor on his hermitage for training in his secret arts. None of us had been surprised by Silas's choice. It sounded just like the hoodoo voodoo kind of thing he'd do, and not tell any one of us about it. He liked to keep his private life pretty secret. He'd done the same thing with magic camp in junior high and Boy Scouts in high school. He was almost an eagle by the time we'd found out about it. Silas had always seen things differently. I'd always see him laughing with us, but for some reason it always felt like he was laughing at. I found myself wondering pretty often what he might actually be laughing about. So then we started looking into other options. The last charge had been a return flight to the next biggest town over with an airport, so we could only assume he'd come home. Then we looked back at our texts over a beer at the local bar. We'd chowed down on peanuts, root beer, fries, and flung some darts while spitballing. Over what leads we might follow, where we might look next. I was getting ready to throw my final dart and reminiscing about how familiar this all felt to our junior high summers after baseball practice, when Chet had turned white as a ghost. He hadn't said anything at first, so I asked him what was up, and he cleared his throat, ummed and awed until we all were adequately annoyed with him. Finally, he admitted he had a text he hadn't replied to, from Silas. He'd completely forgotten about it, apparently. It had come in early in the morning, halfway through our Vegas trip, so we'd cut him some slack. It had been a wild week. But it had said, "Want to come camping with me?" As if he'd completely forgotten about our trip altogether. On that note, we'd figured we'd go out and check the area he liked to camp at most. That would be our next stop. I called in the next morning and took a week off from my firm. The other guys made their own arrangements, and we decided to meet at the trailhead the next morning, packed and ready to go. It was another adventure at the hands of Silas, and I was just sure we'd find him out there practicing his new voodoo junk in the woods, trying to perfect it before showing up with a bang. The guy always did have big dreams. I got my pack ready that night, tent, sleeping bag, etc. Went through the entire checklist to make sure I'd had everything it listed, set and ready to go for the next morning. Chet texted to let me know he'd pick me up at 6, to head out to the Sticks and the National Forest entrance, to Silas's favorite camping place. I was getting excited. We were about to solve a real-life mystery. It felt like an opportunity to step away from the things that had been bothering me lately. I felt like the other guys must have felt the same way, or they wouldn't have jumped on the idea of camping for a week as fast as they did. Or maybe we were all just anxious to find Silas. I could feel the anticipation buzzing in the air while Chet and I made our way through the drive-thru, discussing Silas's potential choices leading up to his disappearance. We made guesses at where we might go to find his car, which spots he liked to park in when going to this specific place. We all wanted to be the first to guess the right circumstances we might find him in. It was all part of our competition. By the time we pulled up to the gravel road, the other two had already made their way to the red Prius they'd parked in front of. It was definitely Silas's. Bumper stickers and all. It looked like it had been there for a while. It was completely covered in dust that had been kicked up by people passing by it. Bobby was squatting at the driver's side door. He wiped at it. Jax looked concerned, and he was pointing toward the back paneling, which appeared to be dented. Once I got closer, I realized all 4 tires were flat. That seemed weird to me. "Hey guys," I greeted them, raising a hand. I'd gotten 2 extra coffees and extended their holding container out toward them. "Thanks," Bobby said, looking back at the door panel. "Check this out, guys." We didn't have to look much closer to see what he was pointing at. It was scratched to hell from the base of the window to the middle of the metal paneling. Chet grunted. "Guess I'm not the only one who hates these things. Check out the tires," he pointed. They weren't just flat. They were torn wide open. Jeez. Jax looked pale. He'd grown up with violence, and something told me this had his spider senses tingling. "Guys, I don't think wolves around here could do something like this," he finished. "Bear, maybe?" Chet offered hopefully. I kept my mouth shut. There were too many things going through my mind. I stood up and pushed the coffee holder in between Jax and Bobby. They took theirs, and we all sat quiet for a second. "Well, whatever the reason, it's good to see you guys more than the assigned once a year," Chet offered, clapping a free hand on my shoulder before slugging it into Jax and Bobby in one blow. The motion seemed to push us into action. We each moved to get our packs and reconvene at the head of the trail on the opposite side of the road from where we'd parked. There was something big about this part of the forest. Not only were the trees tall and thick as my entire body, outstretched arms included, there was something ominous about it, as if it were inviting us in. There was something heavy about it. While I was gathering my things, my wits threatened to unravel, as they always did, when I realized just how big the forest actually was, how easy it would be to get lost inside of. When I turned away from my car and toward the trailhead, the wood chip path leading into the belly of the forest Silas loved so much, my heart beat quicker. The evergreens suddenly looked like huge, jarring teeth, reaching out for anyone willing to step inside them. Silas was in there somewhere. I knew it. His car proved it. I could only hope whatever had gotten his vehicle hadn't gotten him too. By the time we got through the first few twists and turns in the path, leading ever gradually upward, the sun had burnt off most of the morning mists and was leaking through the thick canopy to give some love to the lush green ferns and collage of mosses littered over the forest floor. It was beautiful. The birds and the cicadas and crickets all chimed in together to receive us as their guests. We all stayed pretty quiet, just listening, but I got to thinking that maybe Silas had come back to find his car completely busted up, so he'd hoofed it back to the main road to hitchhike. Nah, and that couldn't be, 'cause he would have used his cards by now. And then that took an entirely different dark turn. One that might require us to broaden our search to potential murder by some psycho who preyed on hitchhiking folks. Or at the very least, kidnapping. I kept those thoughts to myself. The woods were pretty at least, and even though I knew it wouldn't be forever, it was nice that it was still light out for now. I could feel myself appreciating the amount of light seeping through the leaves as its source started to creak toward the other end of the forest. It was like I could almost see the line of fading light closing in behind us, taunting us at every turn. The shadows had started taking on a life of their own, shifting unnervingly until finally Chet broke the silence. "Hey guys," he stammered. "Well, what doesn't make sense to me is the card thing. If he'd left his car behind..." I smiled, feeling a twisted sense of comfort that we'd all thought along the same lines. Why wouldn't he have used any money by now? "I was thinking that too," Bobby agreed. "So," I started, "even if he had been picked up by someone, or something had happened, if he'd been robbed, let's just say, and left for dead somewhere, wouldn't the robber have used his shit by now?" "Huh. Spoken like a true lawyer," Bobby laughed. "Maybe they're waiting for the heat to die down," Jax retorted, before refuting his own conclusion. "Nah, that wouldn't make sense," he finished. "A real criminal would max him out as fast as possible and ditch the evidence if he was worth a shit." He'd grumbled on, but I couldn't hear any more of what he'd said from my position behind him, at the rear of the pack as we drifted further and further down the winding path. We stopped around 1 in the afternoon for a quick lunch of Cliff Bars and bananas. Jax had pulled out a flask, and none of us had been surprised. In fact, I was actually relieved when he lifted his arm to offer it to me. I took it without hesitating, and the others did the same. My eyes started roaming over the shadows, gathering in bundles around the man-made path that only lasted another mile before branching into a less beaten, unnoticeable option. That route would take us to the clearing Silas had found all those years ago. None of us knew how he'd come across it, but it had been the perfect spot for camping, so none of us had really asked. It even had a mountain-fed river running along the far edge of it, the freshest tasting water I'd ever found, and I've been places since. We still had about 4 miles until that came into view, but I was getting nervous over what we might find. Younger people than us had accidentally eaten the wrong thing and been sent into cardiac arrest, so the fact that Silas was young and healthy had nothing to do with anything. Nature didn't give a shit about timeliness. It had agendas of its own to attend to, species to keep and others to wipe from the face of existence forever. It wasn't personal. I smiled at that thought because it sounded like something Silas might have said if he was with us. I saw something out of the corner of my eye as I took my second swig of whatever whiskey Jax had brought along. He had more expensive taste these days, so it was pretty good. But it couldn't distract me from a marked-up tree. It could have been a moose or a bear, I guess. But on second glance and after scrambling up, I was sure it was something different. I got close enough to see it more clearly, scrambling up the path and into the shadow of an especially thick part of the canopy, and I could see what appeared to be a tent carved into the side of the tree, along with a stick figure. No, 5 of them. And around the entire carving was chiseled a large circle, like it was a sign. And through the center of the rough picture, a large X had been scraped. Just below it, scratched through the skin and deep into the meat of the tree, were 2 large letters. N-O. I got so close I could smell the sap leaking into the tree's wounds. There were red streaks preserved beneath the golden liquid filling in the holes. Soon they'd be knots, full of scar tissue. The only thing left is a reminder of whatever this was. But it had been made recently, and I was starting to think its message was meant for specific people. I glanced back at the other guys. To find them talking about something inconsequential, but it brought back the memory of 100 other times where we'd stopped in this exact same place. Come to think of it, Jax was always over here peeing on the base of this tree. so it seemed like whoever'd done this had wanted us to find it. I looked closer at the stick figures. One of them seemed to be scribbled on, or scratched out. Its hands looked different. Instead of being pointed downward and outstretched like the others, they were pointed skyward, with 3 long finger-like extensions on each stick arm. "Hey guys," I called back over my shoulder. "Come look at this." Jax, ever the smart-ass, piped up about not being expected to hold it for me or something stupid. But he got quiet when he got closer. He squatted down next to me as he tore off a piece of jerky from the stick he was holding. His free hand reached to trace over the scratched pictures the same way that I had. I didn't say anything. I didn't want my thoughts to change his, so I waited to hear what he came up with. "Hey, doesn't it look kind of like those old signs Silas used to make all the time, back when he was afraid we'd get lost?" Jax grunted as his finger went over the foreboding N-O and slowed. "That's weird." "What do you see?" I asked. I was really curious. I thought maybe I was making up the stick figure thing and maybe he was seeing something different, but he basically described exactly what I'd thought I'd seen, down to the obvious claws on the slightly separate stick figure. A dark feeling crept into the trees just then. I looked up to see the sun was fading behind the clouds and off into the west faster than any of us would have liked. It was always nice to be set up in the clearing before night fell. Things got dark quick out here, and though I'd never say it to anybody else, it was always nice to be set up and have even the semblance of something standing between you and the shadows crossing seamlessly beneath the trees before night fell. They're what really reigned the night, and under their shadow, sometimes the air felt oppressive. If the crickets ever went quiet after the fire had died down, it felt like something was there, silencing life all around it, until all that was left was dead quiet. It was like some force was out there, choking the lullaby just long enough to let everything around it know it was there, without actually having to show itself. I'd usually feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck in sheer terror at the potential of what might be out there, before my ears actually picked up on the vacancy of sound that had started the feeling in the first place. They say history repeats itself, and if there was one thing that I could be grateful for, it was that, historically, right at the height of those moments, one of the guys would inevitably make a fart sound with their armpit, and we'd all devolve into laughter and join in. And by the time we went quiet, the night would have reappeared to join in on our revolt against the looming threat of something too chicken shit to really show itself. They'd taught me not to fear the shadows, at least not when we were together. But now I'm starting to think that maybe it had never cared enough to involve itself until now. Then all I could think of was Silas, out here by himself with no one to lighten the mood. What if he'd gotten stuck in one of those moments, with no one to laugh in the face of fear with? What if fear had found him vulnerable and swept him away? Which made me wonder, why would he have come out here all by himself, especially after a weird hoodoo retreat? It all felt wrong, totally outside of his nature. He was all about community and togetherness. He was the one who brought these trips together for us and kept us coming back. He had to have said something to someone. Just then I remembered the text he'd sent. Just a simple line. "Will you come camping with me?" But what had been so urgent that he couldn't wait until we'd gotten back? And why hadn't he pushed further for a reply? He must have. It was the only thing that made sense. So who wasn't fessing up? Who wasn't talking? I looked around at the guys. He hadn't gotten a hold of me, and I knew that for sure. So who? Who felt bad right now? My eyes came back to Jax, still hunched down next to me. I asked him again what he thought, but he stayed quiet. He looked concerned as he leaned back on his heels, pulling his hand away from the sappy tree. From the sappy wounds of the tree. Shit, man, I don't know. You think he's playing some elaborate prank? He asked. Like, he didn't want to go to Vegas, and this was his way of getting us all to come do something more, I don't know. His frown deepened. Nature-y? I mean, what do we even know about this medicine man that he was apprenticing for? Jax looked at me as if looking for the same answers as I was. I could almost hear him wondering if I knew more than I was letting on. It was like he was trying to lead me, the same way that I was trying with him. I sighed. He hasn't contacted me since before the Vegas trip, I answered honestly. He was always closer to you and Bobby, though. I figured you'd be the first he'd call. Jax nodded his head, as if it would have made sense for him to have contacted them before Chet and me, but it was true. We didn't understand his lifestyle the same way. It seemed entitled and sloppy to me, but he was happy. And maybe that was the truth of it. I'd been a little bit jealous of the fact that I'd worked my ass off through 2 degrees and had finally gotten myself what I thought would be the perfect job, and I hated it. I got the girl, but, we fight a lot recently, and we've been together for a really long time, so I'd had my questions recently. My curiosities. Shit, I couldn't even masturbate without her breathing down my neck lately. It was like she wanted to be a part of everything. I didn't have any time to myself. I took a deep breath, and maybe that's what this was. A chance for me to get my head free. I laughed, quietly. It was just like Silas, to find the perfect remedy. It kind of felt nice just being out in the open again, just us guys. Nice and quiet outside the fact that our close friend was still missing, and we were sitting in front of what appeared to be a warning for us to turn back. I stood up and walked toward the other two who hadn't bothered to stand up. Bobby was staring into his water bottle like it had transported him 1,000 miles away. I asked him what was up, and he seemed to kind of snap out of his trance. He told me nothing and that it just didn't make sense. None of it. But I got the sense he wasn't telling us everything. So I asked him if he could think of anything else that might help us make sense of everything, because I agreed. None of it seemed to add up. We all knew Silas, and he would have told at least one of us or his parents about his leaving. I was convinced he would have told us because he probably would have hoped that we would all hear about it and show up to surprise him, show our support. But that theory seemed to fall flat unless he was committed enough to the gig to stick it out for 3 whole months, which also seemed unlikely. I stopped talking. What I said made Bobby laugh nervously. Yeah, he agreed. That's probably it. He's just fucking with us. And by the time we get out there, he'll have a fire going for the night and say some stupid shit like, "Took you long enough." Wanting to lighten the mood, I added, I couldn't imagine him with a beard, and the other guys laughed and agreed. Chet questioned whether he could even grow one properly. We packed up and moved on. I didn't mention the red streaks. Had looked like preserved blood to me. I figured there were enough other details to leave us all on edge as we turned from the main path to the dirt trail that would eventually take us to our final destination. At this rate, I figured we'd be up there before 6 and still have a little daylight to work with while setting up if we hurried. The sun would be setting behind the trees, sure, but the clearing would offer relief from the overbearing canopy we were currently trudging beneath. None of us said anything for a while. I could hear labored breathing from the guys in front of me, but it was kind of a relief that none of us had the energy to talk because I didn't really want to hear anything anyone else was thinking. It already felt like the forest was full of eyes and ears, just waiting to bring our deepest fears to fruition. It had always felt that way. Like anything that we said or did could be used against us in the court of natural law. Nothing personal. The shadows were swallowing up more of the forest floor by the minute. I'd been watching my feet and counting my steps to distract from the hair threatening to lift off my neck at any sound coming from outside the path we were currently traveling on. It felt more dangerous being in the lead or heading up the rear, in my opinion. I tried to bite back that fear and numb it with a gradual incline of numbers, trickling in with each footstep. Hey, what's that? It was Chet this time. He was in the middle, and as always, he had his head on a swivel. I followed his finger to a ton of scratches along the bases of the trees just ahead of us. There was a circle with a line through it diagonally, and we all agreed it looked like one of those do not do symbols. Every other trunk had letters scratched into it, some of them over and over again. It looked like something sharp had dug in and carved them out. Two of the larger trees seemed to be covered, trunk to tip, in the strange markings. Further down the path, the method seemed to change. Instead of being scratched, the same symbols and letters looked like they'd been branded or burnt into the bark. KSE. What do you think it means? Chet piped in. Bobby was repeating the 3 letters over and over again, slowing them down as if it might help him. KSE. He said it at least 10 times before he went quiet. I looked up to see shock sliding over his face as he mumbled 3 words. Kill, switch, engage. So, don't kill, switch, engage? Bobby's voice was distant. I was tracing over the scars, etched in varying degrees, over the tree's skin. Yes, KSE. But out of the 3 letters, only one was underlined in each variation without fail. So if it stood for what Bobby suggested, whoever had written it only wanted one of the 3 words represented by each letter to be noticed. E. Engage. So, don't engage. But what could that mean? Was I reading into it too much? I wasn't sure, so I decided to wait. Keep that bit of information to myself until we figured out whether this was an elaborate hoax or something else. A gust of wind tossed the tree canopy to reveal a cloudy sky, looming and ready to cast its contents to the ground to meet us. Hey guys, come on. Let's get back to the clearing before it starts raining, I called. The others agreed, and we carried on, each still absorbed in our own thoughts. It didn't seem real. None of it did. Even the forest. The colors of green felt everlasting, like they might be bearing some untold secrets of their own, some version of what had happened that we couldn't see yet. The thoughts leaking into my mind seemed eerily close to something Silas might have said if he was with us. It was like he'd whispered the idea right into my ear with that last gust of wind. I shook my head. If this was Silas's version of a joke, it was turning sour quick. It was making my stomach roll over uncomfortably while I looked over the effort someone had taken to convey a message. We moved past it, Chet taking pictures as we went. Each of us moved a bit more quickly than before. It was like we suddenly needed some kind of confirmation that Silas was at least still alive. This was getting a little weird, and to be honest, I was getting ready to pull out my phone and start recording in case something crazy did happen. If there was some crazed killer or human-killing animal, I wanted whoever came looking for us to at least know what they were looking for. I thought of Emily, how I hadn't called her after we'd pulled up like I'd promised. It felt kind of bad to know that she probably just expected that kind of shit at this point. It hadn't dawned on me before that maybe that's why she'd been frustrated. But I knew just the same, given a few days, she'd start snooping around looking for me, finding ways to reach me. She had my parents' numbers, and she'd actually come with us on one of our earlier camping trips, so she knew the place. Come to think of it, we'd had a lot of fun together. The guys had liked her. I felt like I was moving as fast as I could. I looked up the path. I felt like I'd been moving fast, but the others seemed to be pulling ahead of me. It wasn't safe to get too far behind the rest of the pack, and I knew that, so I stepped up my game. One wrong move and even the best mountain men might find themselves turned around, lost, and alone. I'd read stories about people getting lost, just a mile from some camping lodge. They'd stayed out in the woods thinking they'd never see society again when, just over the next ridge, there was a 5-star meal and room waiting. Instead, they'd starved because they just stopped walking too soon. I should have called her. Maybe she could have come along. It would have been nice to have someone to snuggle with in the tent. I was spiraling, looking for comfort. I almost slapped myself as a burst of wind flung down from the treetops to toss me sideways. I caught hold of a fallen tree. My fingers sank into the moss, climbing along its edges, as I caught my breath and my footing all at once, grateful for the near miss. The boulder field, 20 feet below, was probably much less forgiving than the green, spongy cushion squeezed in my fist. Whatever had occupied my mind before was long gone now. All I could picture were the 1,000 fates Silas might have been met with. I couldn't imagine staying out here by myself on purpose, without getting a hold of anyone for so long. I scrambled with the zipper of my jacket pocket to pull out my cell phone. As expected, there was no service at all, just a little symbol that looked a lot like the one scrawled over Jax's pea tree at our normal lunch resting point. The symbols hadn't appeared again until we'd gotten well down our secret hiking trail. The same one that would lead us all the way to the clearing. No one else would have seen the signs but us four, and we knew it deep down. I watched the 3 guys in front of me pushing branches out of the way, each instinctively looking in all directions while letting their feet take them where they would. Jax seemed more uneasy than the others all of a sudden. "Hey guys," he suddenly broke the silence. "Maybe this is a stupid fucking idea. What if we're just wasting our time when we should be talking to the police or the Forest Service? They know these places like the back of their hands." What he said made sense. "Yeah, well, we know Silas like the back of ours. We already found his car, dude. We know he's out here," Bobby tossed back without pause. "If he isn't, then we'll do that. But why stir shit up if he's just out here, finding himself?" Jax grunted, but didn't argue the point. Me and Chet stayed quiet because they'd basically said everything that needed to be said, really. And the rest we'd see soon enough, I guess. In less than a mile, and thank God, because it was already starting to get a little darker than I felt comfortable stumbling through. I'd already pulled my headlight out from the pack and pulled it over my dome. I figured it was better to have everything I needed out and ready instead of packed away and useless. I'd even shifted my bear mace to the side pocket so I could easily reach my hand around for it, should the need arise. It's better to be prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. The closer we got to the area, the more lack of campfire smells started to bother me. By the time we could see red and orange sun streaks marking the entrance of our destination, my sense of relief at making it had diminished to a single hope. Maybe Silas was conserving fire supplies. As soon as we stepped foot in the clearing, I could tell something was wrong. The bushes along the side of the lightly worn-in dirt path looked like Freddy and Jason had a knife fight in the middle of them. A sapling was torn out of the ground and tossed at least 12 feet from the point its roots had appeared to have been. And from the looks of it, it would have taken brute strength to pull those roots up out of the ground. Bobby was already standing over the tree to inspect it. He wrapped both arms around it and tried to bear hug it upright. After a minute or two of struggling, Chet had jumped in to help while Jax and I made our way to the far side of the clearing. My eyes were glued to the ground, mesmerized by the deep ruts carved into the dirt. They trailed through the grass. Lobs of turf and tufts of unearthed greenery lay scattered in the markings' wake. It was like the change in terrain hadn't done anything to phase its trajectory. The marks remained consistent. Whatever it had been had really dug in. "Are you seeing this?" I breathed to Jax. I looked up when he didn't reply, and he nodded, never taking his eyes off the scratched surface. "What could have done this?" I asked. "A bear wouldn't leave marks like this. It almost looks like..." I couldn't make myself say what I was imagining. It sounded too stupid. And I couldn't see any footprints to mark the real size of the thing, so my imagination went wild. I imagined anything with claws that could dig in that deep had to be massive. And if those were markings from its hands, then where were the deep imprints left by the steps it took while dragging their claws along? The more I thought of it, the more intense the image became of some childhood nightmare I'm sure I had. White fur, red glowing eyes, abnormally large, huge mouth with jagged layers of pointed teeth. I glanced away from the tracks and my buddy. Just off to the side were boot tracks. As if to add to the weirdness, just off to the side were boot tracks, perfectly visible, close to a fire pit I hadn't seen in my excitement over the claw prints. The other two had finished what they were doing with the tree. They'd lifted it into the hole it had come from as best they could, and had piled dirt in all around it. A few of its roots were still showing through, but it seemed to have given them some peace of mind, not having to look at the tree that had been pulled out of the ground like a weed. I looked around while they caught up on the scratch marks. Chet had pulled out his phone again and was taking pictures and videos. Probably a good idea. I started scanning the area, but through it all, my eyes almost refused to look past the bush line. The silhouettes hanging under the trees seemed thicker somehow now that we had the sunset sinking deeper into the west sky behind us. A cool, wet breeze howled into the clearing, drawing my attention to the trees lining the rushing river. Something tossed from the branches of a thick, tall oak, taunting me through the shadows. I left the others behind me to check it out a little more closely. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized I was looking at the last thing I wanted to see. Through that first layer of the forest and along the edge of the rushing river, slung violently over a large limb of the shadowed oak, was a bright orange, shredded sleeping bag. My foot came down with a crunch as something bent under my weight. I lifted my boot to see the torn edge of a tent stuffed beneath the bushes. As if on cue, a roll of distant thunder rumbled around us. "Hey guys?" My voice felt hollow. "I think I found Silas's stuff." To be continued. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in. If you like this content, please feel free to support my channel. I will leave a link to my Patreon in the description below. If you have any specific story ideas or things that you'd like to hear more of, also please feel free to leave those in the comments. I'm always looking for new ideas to play with. Thank you for helping me do what I love.